Oh, I didn't know how much.
What a beautiful day we have here at Fort Collier, and we're so glad you all came out. I'm Catherine Solenberger. I'm the president of the Fort Collier Civil War Center. We're a nonprofit, and we've been in existence since 2000 when we wrote a grant to purchase the property, and we had to match that grant 1/3. We got 1/3 of the purchase price of $500,000, and we had to come up with the other 2/3. So we had 1 year, and by gracious donations from the community, Frederick County, and the American Battlefield Protection Program grant, we were able to purchase this property. And so we've been, with the help of Jonathan and all of our board members, able to continue with programming. And we just had the house painted. We just are doing a lot of things here with your all's help. So we're so glad you're here today. And I'm going to introduce Jonathan Noyalas. He's a professor and the head of the McCormick Civil War Institute at Shenandoah University. And he's going to have our wonderful program today. Jonathan?
Right. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to Fort Collier Civil War Center. If you have any questions over about the next hour or so, please don't hesitate when I'm done talking to raise your hand and ask that question. One of the things I do want to mention is that everything that is preserved out here, interpreted out here, maintained out here is all a result of private donations and membership fees. So we are running a special offer at the Fort Collier Civil War Center. So here's the commercial advertisement to begin our program. If you join the Fort Collier Civil War Center today for the bargain fee of $45, you will be entered into a special drawing once the tour is over. We'll actually conclude in the activities room over here. We will pull your name for an opportunity to win one of 3 signed copies of my latest book, The Blood-Tinted Waters of the Shenandoah, courtesy of Robin Carroll Bleck. So if you're doing the math, that's a $16.95 book, so $45, it's a great value because you get a book maybe, and you obviously help out Fort Collier. When you look at civilians in the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War, and I think this applies beyond the valley as well, you can categorize civilians into one of 3 different categories. They are either Unionist, they are pro-Confederate, or they are what I call leave-aloners, people who don't want to have anything to do with this conflict at all. And I would argue, based on my years of research, that the family who lived here, Isaac Stine, his wife Catherine, and their 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, ranged at the war's outset between the ages of 2 and 9, I would argue that Isaac Stine was a leave-aloner. Isaac Stine, like a number of individuals who lived in the Shenandoah Valley in their early to mid-40s, simply had one ultimate goal in mind during those 4 years of conflict, and that was protecting their family, making certain that they were safe and secure from the ravages and tragedy of Civil War. As much as Isaac Stine would have wanted to remain isolated, neutral, and protect his family, insulate them from this conflict, it was an impossibility because of the location of his farm. So the property that is owned by the Fort Collier Civil War Center today, it comprises about 10 acres. During the Civil War, this farm was about 380 acres. Isaac moved here with his wife in early October of 1859. So they're here, just a few years before the secession crisis and Civil War breaks out. This farm is located along one of the most important thoroughfares throughout the Shenandoah Valley, the paved Valley Pike. So north of Winchester, we call it the Martinsburg Pike, what is Route 11 today. So in June of 1861, when Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston occupied Winchester, his troops arrive on June the 17th. He is wanting to safeguard his command from a potential invasion from Union General Robert Patterson's command in Martinsburg. And so as he's looking around with his chief engineering officer, Major William Henry Chase Whiting, trying to figure out where can I build a fortification to erect an obstacle to a potential advance from Patterson, William Henry Chase Whiting recommended this spot right here because it is adjacent to the Martinsburg Pike. So beginning in the first week of July 1861, a contingent of Confederate soldiers, Virginia militia, and Union prisoners of war captured at the Battle of Falling Waters, which was fought in West Virginia on July 2nd, were responsible for building this massive earthwork fortification. During the course of that construction, I find this absolutely remarkable. This was a place that was open to the public to come and visit. And if you think about Winchester at the outset of the war, about 4,500 people living in the city, not really an exciting town. And so when you have troops here and when you have an earthwork fortification being constructed, it's something to go and see. Well, one of the individuals who came out here to visit Fort Collier while it was under construction was a local Unionist woman from Winchester. Her name was Hattie Griffith. And I'm always struck by what Hattie Griffith wrote in her diary on August 21st, 1861. Because she comes out here with her father and other members of her family, and she sees everything that's happening out here. She sees this beehive of activity, and she's just really struck by it. And this is what she wrote. I have this day visited the breastworks or fortifications out on the Martinsburg Pike with Father and Johnny. Was exceedingly interested. First work of the kind I had ever seen. The first time I was ever so near a cannon. I looked into them. The cannonballs weigh 42 pounds each. There were 4 cannons planted and much ammunition there. A great many men working, and I saw the powder magazines. They have several rifle ports which seem so secure. I have read of them. I've always found that curious. I thought, why is Hattie Griffith reading books about the, earthwork fortifications? But in any event, that's what she found entertaining. I have read of them, but have never seen them. They had several mass batteries. It seems real strong and well built. There is a high embankment of sandbags, barrels, and brush covered with dirt, partly sodded over. They intend to sod it with a big ditch on the lower side. They have completely surrounded Stine's house, which is now occupied by soldiers, some of whom were working there, some cooking, some washing, some on guard, some lounging, and some sleeping. So this is a really detailed description of what this place looks like in the summer of 1861. But as she was going throughout that diary entry on August 21st, there's a moment where she pauses and she realizes why this place is being built. Today, we gather here as Civil War historians and enthusiasts and tourists. She was, in essence, in the summer of 1861, a tourist. But this is not being built as a tourist attraction. This is being built for war. This is being built potentially as a place where a battle can occur, where people can be killed and wounded, and people's lives forever altered. Whether it's the soldier or the family at home who suffers the loss of a loved one. And so when Hattie Griffith, who was a Quaker, by the way, when she got to the end of this diary, she had this moment of pause and she reflected. And she wrote as follows: "It is surely something to be remembered, but I hope it will never be used." For much of the conflict, Fort Collier was not used. There are moments throughout its history where you are going to have Union or Confederate soldiers inside of the fort, camping here, milling about. There's a moment in the aftermath of the Battle of Rutherford's Farm, fought on July 20th, 1864, just north of here. So if you're familiar with Winchester, you know where Lowe's and Target is, that's the Rutherford's Farm battlefield. So there's a moment after that battle where Confederate soldiers under General Stephen Dodson Ramsey's command are inside of Fort Collier. But it has yet to be attacked. There has yet to be any blood spilled on Fort Collier. But that will all change on the afternoon of September 19th, 1864. So I will take questions now if you have them. And then once we're done, we're going to proceed around the back side of the house here and set up the third battle of Winchester. Any questions? Yes, Blake.
Where are the Stines originally from?
So the Stines are from the Valley, and I'm glad you brought this up. So this is one thing I did not mention. So when the Confederates show up and they start building Fort Collier, Isaac Stine takes his wife and 4 kids and they leave. And so they go and they live with a family member at Coe Farm, which is located northwest of here. While they're living there, they stay there until the Second Battle of Winchester in mid-June of 1863. And Coe Farm actually sits within the path of artillery shells passing over Star Fort. And so it's after that moment he says, yeah, this is not the safest place. And so he lives out the remaining 2 years of the war with his brother Franklin, who is in Clark County, Virginia. What's interesting, and this is why I would argue he's a leave-aloner and really is not all gung-ho for the Confederacy. While the fort was being constructed, he was visiting here regularly, keeping tabs on what the Confederates were using from his property. And so he was charging them for everything. He was sending them regular bills, and I know this because in the National Archives, in his Confederate citizens file, and a lot of those files were destroyed during the evacuation from Richmond, but luckily his survives, there's all these receipts, including for the daily rental of his wagon. And so toward the end of the summer of 1861, he sent Joe Johnston a bill for $1,099.34. So if you adjust that for inflation, which we all know is crazy out of control, that's almost $40,000 today. That's a sizable amount of money. He also, when he was called to muster into the local Virginia militia company, he said, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And it shows up on the muster sheet that he was absent. So those are the things that I look at as a historian when I don't have a diary from him saying, hey, this is what I think. That's what leads me to that conclusion. Various opportunities throughout the day today to go out to the 3rd Winchester Battlefield Park that is managed and maintained by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. And you'll have opportunities to look at various moments during the fighting that occurred on September 19th, 1864. But in case you're not going to go out there for whatever reason, I wanted to provide some context to understand how we get here on the afternoon of September the 19th. So General Philip Sheridan, who is the commander of the Army of the Shenandoah at the 3rd Battle of Winchester, he took command of that army, the largest army ever assembled in the Shenandoah Valley, during the first week of August, 1864. And all throughout the first month of his command tenure, Phil Sheridan was given very clear directions from President Lincoln, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant. And it was this: do not go out and attack early unless you can be certain that you can defeat him. Because if you go out and you fight early and you lose, it could be politically detrimental for Abraham Lincoln and his chances for re-election in that upcoming campaign in November. So it's important to understand, first and foremost, that everything that happens in the autumn of 1864 has that election of 1864 looming so very largely over it. It's not just about a battle in an isolated moment. It is about a battle that is part of a much bigger, broader picture. So Phil Sheridan did what he was asked to do during the first month in command. And there was some maneuvering, there were some minor skirmishes and scrapes, most notably the Battle of Berryville during the first week of September 1864, but there was nothing clear, there was nothing decisive. For President Lincoln, I think he was simultaneously happy and angry with Phil Sheridan. He was happy that Sheridan did not risk a disaster on the battlefield, but about a month into this thing, Lincoln also understood that if Phil Sheridan just sits in the valley and maneuvers a lot and doesn't do anything, well, that's not going to bode well for Lincoln's campaign chances either. So on September the 12th, President Lincoln communicated with Ulysses S. Grant, basically asking Grant, what can we do to kick Sheridan into high gear? And Lincoln said, I'm willing to give Sheridan 10,000 more troops. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. And Grant said, relax, calm down, I've got this covered. So he sent Sheridan a note the following day that said, on September 17th, I am going to meet with you in Charlestown, West Virginia. They are not going there to gamble. Of course, Charlestown Hollywood Casino didn't exist yet, but when Sheridan received that message, he was a little nervous because Sheridan didn't know what Grant was coming there to talk to him about. And so when your boss, sends you a note, says, I want to meet with you in 4 days, and that's all it says, guess what starts to run wild? Your imagination.
Fired.
You're fired. And this is what Sheridan is thinking in part. Maybe I'm fired, or at a minimum, maybe I'm going to be given a plan to implement that I don't like. And so Sheridan knew he had to create a plan. He had to lay it all out and be organized and ready before he went to that meeting in Charlestown. So to help him acquire information about the strength of Early's army, the whereabouts of Early's army, his capacity for reinforcements, General Sheridan relied on 2 civilians, a young Quaker schoolteacher in Winchester, Rebecca Wright, and an enslaved man from Clark County, Virginia, Thomas Laws. And there were some of you in the audience today who were out at 3rd Winchester on Thursday and heard my remarks about Laws. I'm not going to go into that much detail, but basically what happens is Thomas Laws carries a message from Sheridan to Rebecca Wright, asking Rebecca Wright for help. Ultimately, Rebecca Wright decides to assist Sheridan, and she reveals that a division of infantry commanded by General Joseph Kershaw and an artillery battalion commanded by Major Wilfred Cutshaw leave the Shenandoah Valley to go back to Lee's lines at Petersburg, because Lee did not believe that Sheridan was much of a threat in the valley because he hadn't done anything, just a lot of maneuvering, no decisive engagements. So that message is carried back to Philip Sheridan. Sheridan lays out a plan, and when he takes that information, coupled with what his scouts are telling him, that Early's army is not concentrated in Winchester, but rather it is spread out between Winchester heading north toward Martinsburg, Sheridan goes to that meeting in Charlestown and he says exactly what he's going to do. He tells Grant, don't even tell me what your plan is. He lays it on the table at the Rutherford House, and Grant simply says, go in. So Sheridan's plan was to strike Ramser's division, which was situated east of Winchester in what is known as the Berryville Canyon. So Berryville Canyon today is Route 7, if you're familiar with the area. So if you look at this map right here, okay, you can see General Sheridan's approach. So he is approaching from the east. So the battle begins about 4:30 that morning when Union cavalry from James Wilson's division crosses the Apecan Creek at Spout Spring Ford. The first major Union infantry assault begins at 11:40 a.m. So it's hard to imagine because of all of the development, and this development again speaks to the importance of battlefield preservation. Like, development's happening at a rapid rate in this part of the valley, and a lot of green space is going away very, very quickly. So you have to use your imagination for a moment and think that this is all open farm fields. So if you're standing at this spot around noon on September 19th, 1864, you would see elements of William Emery's 19th Corps launching their attacks through the middle field. You would see elements of Horatio Wright's 6th Corps launching their attacks against Confederates in the West Woods. And you would have seen as the day progressed into the early part of the afternoon, those lines getting closer and closer and closer and closer to the city of Winchester. Now, while the bulk of the fighting was happening east of us, a few miles north of Winchester, there was also some pretty severe action going on. Because Sheridan didn't want to just attack, frontal direct east. What he wanted to do was to take his cavalry, the 2 divisions that had not been engaged at the Apecan Crossing, Wesley Merritt's and William Averell's division. he crossed them at different fords along the Apechan Creek north of Winchester. To show you how far north this extended, there are some men in Averell's Cavalry Division who are crossing the Apechan Creek in the southern part of Berkeley County, West Virginia. All right, so we are talking, 9-10 miles north of where we're at right now. So this is a massive, massive movement. And once those crossings happen, and once the Apechan is secure, what Sheridan wants to do is he wants to turn his cavalry and face them to the south. And it's ultimately, as that fighting happens throughout the course of the day, and we'll talk about this more at our next stop, that is what sets the stage for this most remarkable moment on the late afternoon of September 19th, 1864, when 6,000 Union cavalry charge against the Confederate position here at Fort Collier. So I'm going to stop my remarks there. I'll take any questions, and then we'll proceed out to the other side of the house and talk about that attack. Questions, Catherine? Have to use your imagination a little bit. So this whole area where I'm looking north of us right now, this is all one big, massive open plain. It's just nothing but farm fields. And so you can see a great distance from here. So as the fighting was happening east of Winchester all throughout the early part of the afternoon, you have Union cavalry, as I said, is trying to cross at different fords along the Apechan Creek. And then once those crossings are complete, they're going to push this way and then turn south. Now, as the battle unfolded that afternoon, Jubal Early wasn't thinking about what was happening north of him. He was thinking what was happening to the east of Winchester. So he sent a message out to General John Breckinridge, who was in overall command of those Confederate troops from Gabriel Wharton's division and troops from General John McCausland's Cavalry Division, which was under command of Colonel Milton Ferguson. He had sent a note to Breckinridge because of all the pressure that they were confronting over here, said, I need you to withdraw your men from north of Winchester and support the rest of the Army of the Valley east of Winchester. Breckinridge wanted to do that, but there was a major, major problem. The problem was that if he just broke off contact, he felt that Wesley Merritt and William Averell would rapidly pursue his troops and annihilate them. So he said, we basically have to manage this withdrawal. And so as Breckinridge communicated how desperate the situation was north of Winchester, Jubal Early decided to send General Fitzhugh Lee, commanding the Confederate cavalry, with 2,000 additional troopers to slow the Union cavalry as they were getting closer and closer and closer to Winchester. So in that area where Lowe's and Target now sits, Fitzhugh Lee is going to array 2,000 Confederate cavalry, and he's going to try to slow Merritt and Averell. There's a point that afternoon where Fitzhugh Lee can see the handwriting on the wall. He understands that this is probably not going to end well. But he thought, we have to try to do something to slow the Union advance. And so Fitzhugh Lee launches a cavalry assault against Merritt and Averell. There's a moment where troops like George Armstrong Custer, who is commanding a brigade in Merritt's division, are kind of shocked by this. But Custer wrote about this after the battle. He said, I was shocked that Fitzhugh Lee did it, but after I think about it, that's probably what I would have done as well. Even though I'm outnumbered 3-1, I probably would have done that to try to stymie any assault from the opposition. After that assault happens, Fitzhugh Lee and Wharton's division, they start pulling back closer and closer and closer and closer to where we're at right now at Fort Collier. So as the Confederate line is pulling back this way, it's also pulling closer to the city from the east. So you get to this point around 3:30, 4 o'clock that afternoon, where the Confederate line has basically taken the shape of an inverted L. Part of it facing that way, part of it facing that way. As that Confederate line contracted, Phil Sheridan was licking his chops, because Phil Sheridan had a very different perspective about how cavalry should be used. Up until this point in the war, cavalry was used by, individuals like George Meade, for instance, commander of the Army of the Potomac. He thought cavalry should be used to guard supply trains. It should be used for reconnaissance, but it shouldn't be used as this massive offensive weapon. Sheridan thought it should. And so Sheridan looks at the nature of the ground. He looks at this Confederate line contracting, and he says, I am going to do something that has never before been done, not only in this conflict, but in American history. I'm going to send the largest cavalry force ever assembled to attack a fixed position of the enemy's infantry. And so when the orders come down that they are going to launch this massive assault, so this is hard for me to conceive. It would be awesome to reconstruct this in some kind of virtual world. You have 6,000 Union cavalry. That line is over a half a mile long. So it's horse stacked upon horse upon horse. They are all arrayed coming this direction. And when the order came down to launch this cavalry assault, there were a lot of cavalrymen who were excited because they had been waiting for a moment like this their entire lives. Colonel James Kidd wrote that this would be the first proper use of this arm, meaning the cavalry, in a great battle. So as they were preparing for this attack, and they were getting their alignments readjusted, and the troops were preparing, and the flags are flapping in the breeze, and the bugles are blaring, George Custer thought this was fantastic. George Custer wrote of the martial air of this moment before the charge happened. The bands playing national airs presented in the sunlight one mass of glittering sabers. This, combined with the various and bright-colored banners and battle flags, intermingled here and there with the plain blue uniforms of the troops, furnished one of the most inspiring as well as imposing scenes of martial grandeur ever witnessed on a battlefield. No encouragement was needed to inspire either man or horse. So the Federals are excited. There are some who are not. William Averell, one of Sheridan's cavalry division commanders, did not think that his troopers were up to the task because they were the ones who were crossing the Opequon in southern part of Berkeley County. And so his men had been in the saddle since about 1 o'clock that morning. They were exhausted, they were tired. Averell lodged his complaint with Sheridan, and Sheridan's response was, I really could give a goddamn about horseflesh today. Let's do this. So Phil Sheridan gives that go-ahead, and about 4 o'clock, if you're standing here, you would see and feel that charge. There are 24,000 horse hooves hitting the ground. So imagine what that felt like, imagine what that sounded like. From the Confederates who were in and around Fort Collier. So you are going to have troopers from Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry. You are going to have soldiers from Colonel George Patton's infantry brigade in this area. You are going to have Confederate artillery 4 guns from Captain Sam Chapman's Monroe artillery inside of the fort. From the perspective of the Confederates, this was simultaneously cool and horrifying because they had never seen anything before like this. And, for those of you in the crowd who are Gettysburg aficionados, I think it's very similar to Longstreet's assault at Gettysburg, what people call famously Pickett's Charge. The Union soldiers behind that wall seeing that line moving forward saying, wow, cool, but not cool. And I think you have Confederates thinking that at this moment as well. There was one Confederate soldier in Fort Collier wrote, I never saw such a sight in my life as that of the tremendous force, the flying banners and flashing sabers coming at us from the north, upon the left flank and the rear of our army. Now, as the cavalry charge begins, and again, we're talking in that vicinity of where Lowe's is at and where Denny's is at. So they start out at a walk, a trot, and then when they get about 400 or 500 yards away from this spot, it is spurs in, it is full gallop, dashing forward toward this position. It is at this moment in time that all organization breaks apart. And it really is horses moving at different speeds toward this spot and that whole part of the Confederate line that is facing northward. And you have to realize here that the Confederate line is going to extend across the Martinsburg Pike, heading in that direction. And so the troops who are going to strike right here are from Colonel Charles Russell Lowell's Reserve Brigade. So as Lowell's men are advancing, you are going to have Confederate artillerists from Chapman's battery inside of Fort Collier. They open fire, and it stymies that advance. As the attack starts to break up, there are troops from Wharton's division, these guys are from Patton's brigade, are actually going to come out of Fort Collier, place themselves on the Martinsburg Pike, and fire into the flank, into the end of Lowell's line. So initially, if you're a Confederate, you're thinking, maybe we have a chance. But then something happens. Lowell reorganizes his command. He brings in Lieutenant William Cuyler's 3rd U.S. Artillery, places them on the Valley Pike, right over there, and he orders them to open fire on the Confederates here. So as that artillery opens fire, you have soldiers who were involved in that first assault who have been struck by Confederate bullets or Confederate artillery fragments, and they are writhing on the ground in agony. One of those individuals who was writhing around in the ground in agony was Captain Theophilus Rodenbaugh of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry. Rodenbaugh had received the Medal of Honor, or would receive the Medal of Honor, for gallantry at the Battle of Trevelyan Station a few months earlier. But as he was on the ground here in agony, he had received a very severe wound to his right arm. Ultimately, that right arm would be amputated. One of the members of his regiment, this guy right here, Sergeant Conrad Schmidt, a German immigrant, one of 213,000 German immigrants to serve in the Union Army. 23.4% of all Union soldiers were immigrants. Sergeant Conrad Schmidt saw Rodenbaugh. He was on horseback. He came, scooped him up, and carried him off of the field. Schmidt received the Medal of Honor for that action right here at Fort Collier on the afternoon of the 19th. As Lowell reorganizes, he regroups his men. Cuyler's battery is wreaking havoc on the Confederates inside of Fort Collier, and this is the moment where things begin to turn very, very badly for the Confederates. This is where you get to that chaotic moment where Union soldiers can start to see the beginning of the end. They can start to see, the finish line to Union triumph at 3rd Winchester. So I'll take questions if you have them. I'd like to then go inside of the fort and continue our discussion. Questions?
How many Union lines were there that attacked? Were they just one, or?
They are in 2 lines of horses, so 2 ranks.
Was anybody shooting back at Cuyler?
Yeah, Chapman was trying. So we're standing right now inside of Fort Collier, and so again, you'd have to imagine that Chapman's guns are going to be positioned here, pointing in that direction. Now, during the fight between Cuyler and Chapman, 2 of those Confederate cannon are going to become disabled. So by the time that second cavalry assault happens, Chapman is down to 2 cannon. And so if you're Chapman, you're in a very undesirable situation because you have 4 Union guns over here shooting at you. You have cavalry coming at you. What do you do? And so Chapman is going to try very desperately with his Monroe artillery, what is left of it, to try to stave off that assault. But when the men from Patton's brigade break, and when they start to see other Confederate troops who have been facing east all day, when they see them starting to break, they realize ultimately that it is time to get out. Now, it is during the final moments before Chapman's battery withdraws and they abandon their guns. Before those guys get out of here, Chapman is wounded in the back. He's actually shot, more than likely with a piece of artillery fragment from one of Cuyler's guns in his left shoulder blade. The wound proves mortal. He is taken from the battlefield He's actually taken to a Confederate hospital in Charlottesville. He died 9 days after the battle. His cause of death, by the way, was tetanus. So there's a great reason why you should get your tetanus shot. Now, as Union cavalry make this second assault, this is what breaks the Confederate line, as one Union soldier wrote, into 1,000 fragments. So as this Confederate line is beginning to crumble here, and troops are streaming this way, and troops are streaming that way, there is one Confederate general who is trying to stave off, and that is Brigadier General Brian Grimes. So Brian Grimes, who is a brigade commander in Robert Rhodes's division, he is trying to take his men from facing east, reposition them to face north. And I think there's a moment in time where human instinct, your survival instinct, kicks in. It does not take a genius to realize Confederates are not going to win this battle, things are not going all that well. And so when Grimes gives the order to reposition, to realign his men to face them to the north, where do you think a lot of Grimes men end up wanting to go? That away. So Grimes is appalled by this, and he's riding up and down his line, threatening to shoot men who retreat. And when he runs out of, his 6 rounds in his revolver, he's threatening to beat them with the flat of his blade of his sword. That has no effect at all. And Grimes's men are heading that way. Now, as realistic as Confederate soldiers were, understanding they are outnumbered, they are outgunned, we have no other alternative but to retreat and withdraw, there are attempts made to stop that Confederate withdrawal. So as you get closer to Winchester, maybe about a quarter of a mile in this direction, there are Confederate officers. Henry Kidd Douglas writes about this in his book, I Rode with Stonewall. He was on early staff during the time of the Third Battle. He wrote about something he had never seen happen before on a Civil War battlefield. He saw infantry form a hollow square. So this is a tactic that had been employed for centuries for infantry to deal with a cavalry assault. And so basically you form a hollow square, you fix your bayonet, you put the butt of your musket here, you have the musket angled like this at the chest of the horse, and you cross your fingers and toes and pray to God and hope it works. But this is what Henry Kidd Douglas wrote about this moment. For the first time, I saw a division of infantry, or what was left of one, form a hollow square to resist cavalry. Unfortunately, it did not do much. There is one other effort, there is one other attempt to try to stop the Confederate withdrawal, and it comes not from Confederate soldiers, but civilians in Winchester. So even though Winchester, like every single community in the Confederacy, has a population, as I said earlier when I opened the tour, with different loyalties and allegiances, it is still predominantly Confederate. And so there were a group of women led by the wife of Confederate General John B. Gordon, who is a division commander here, and another very prominent woman from Winchester, Mary Greenhow Lee. They come out onto Market Street, what is today Cameron Street. So if you know where the George Washington Hotel is, many of you were at the SVBF conference yesterday that I spoke at. So you have to imagine this scene where there are a few dozen women who are forming a human chain across that street, locking hands, begging and pleading with the Confederates to stop. And all those pleas fall on deaf ears. They simply go around, or they take a different route. By 5:30, Third Battle of Winchester is over. It has clearly been decided in favor of the Union. So I want to just say a few things before we close here and head back into the exhibition area, where I want to just mention a few things. The Third Battle of Winchester is the first in a string of Union victories that will culminate 1 month later with triumph at the Battle of Cedar Creek. And it is that battle on October the 19th that finally wrests control from Confederates of the Shenandoah Valley. For Union soldiers who fight at 3rd Winchester, Union soldiers who are part of armies that have been here in 1862 and 1863 and been part of those defeated forces, this was an inspiring moment for them. John Meade Gould, who was an officer in the 29th Maine, basically wrote in his journal after the Third Battle of Winchester was over that he felt a sense of relief. He felt that a big weight had been lifted from his shoulders because he was part of the Union Army that was here in May of 1862, that was defeated at the hands of Stonewall Jackson. For Confederates, there is an element of demoralization. Now, some Confederates are thinking the defeat is an anomaly, that we are accustomed to success, and maybe in a stronger place, a better defensive position, we can make a better accounting of ourselves. I think that sentiment starts to dip dramatically 3 days later after another Union victory at the Battle of Fisher's Hill. This victory at 3rd Winchester is something that buoys spirits tremendously in the North. So it's not just about Sheridan winning a battle. It's about Sheridan winning a battle that shows how foolish George McClellan's Democratic platform is. Because as many of you know, George McClellan, one of the planks in his platform was the war has been a complete failure. Well, Sherman, when he captured Atlanta on September 2nd, he illustrated that's incorrect. 3rd Winchester reinforces that. And every other successive victory Phil Sheridan has will further reinforce how stupid McClellan's platform was. So this is going to significantly aid Abraham Lincoln in his bid for re-election. Abraham Lincoln sends a personal note of gratitude to Phil Sheridan for this victory at 3rd Winchester. But because this battle means so much to the Union, there is a struggle for memory in the immediate aftermath of the battle and for decades after the war. So after the battle was over, there are newspaper accounts, there are poems, there are songs written about the third battle. There's a blow-up of one of these poems in the exhibition area that I'd encourage you to read. The large majority of these poems talk about the great heroic efforts of the Infantry Corps, the 6th Corps, the 19th Corps, and George Crook's Army of West Virginia, what people refer to popularly as the 8th Corps. But as all of these things are being written, with a few exceptions, there is one part of the Army of the Shenandoah that is left out, and that is the cavalry. And so the cavalry in the Army of the Shenandoah, they take slight to this. And there's a lot of bickering, a lot of fighting that happens in the decades after the war in publications like the National Tribune, which is a newspaper written and published specifically for Union veterans. It's a weekly newspaper. I'm always struck by what one Union cavalryman who fought here at 3rd Winchester wrote. He said, every time someone writes the story of the Battle of Apechin, which is what Union soldiers called the Third Battle of Winchester. Every time someone writes the story of the Battle of Apechin and they leave out the cavalry and the important role that the cavalry played in delivering that final hammering blow, it is like giving the play of Hamlet and not having the character Hamlet in the play. There is going to be one thing, however, that will, over the course of the decades, place the cavalry right at the epicenter of the history of this engagement. And it is this piece of art right here. So this painting, entitled Sheridan's Cavalry Charge at Winchester, was painted in the mid-1880s by Thurd de Thulstrup. So Thurd de Thulstrup was a Swedish-born artist, came to the United States in the early 1870s, and he was one of 2 artists commissioned by the lithography firm of Lewis Prang and Company to create a series of paintings capturing the Civil War's most significant and important moments. What I find curious about this is that of the 18 paintings in this series, 2 of them come from the 1864 Shenandoah campaign. This one And then there's a depiction of Sheridan at the Battle of Cedar Creek, which, by the way, Phil Sheridan hated that depiction. But in any event, when this painting was released, and if you look at it, and you're all welcome to look at it once we're done here, it shows Theophilus Rodenbaugh right here. It shows Charles Russell Lowell leading his men. It also puts George Custer in there. Now, George Custer is not here. He is over there. But Custer's popular by this point, and so if you put Custer in a painting, it means it's probably going to sell more. But in any event, when this painting came out, the cavalrymen who made this charge, they were really struck by this. Rodenbaugh wrote, he was able to see this on exhibition in Philadelphia, and this is what he wrote to Thulstrup. He said, "I heartily congratulate you upon the fidelity which you have reproduced the scene as I remembered it. You have attained an exceptional degree of realism in the composition of your picture." Phil Sheridan loved this painting so much that he placed it on an easel right in front of his desk in the War Department during his final years when he served as General-in-Chief of the United States Army between 1883 and 1888. But this cavalry attack, everything we've talked about today, it also is used to be a great exemplar of courage under fire, heroism, and patriotism. A number of years ago, I wrote an article in Civil War Times about this particular attack. And I was struck going through old textbooks from the 1880s into the early part of the 1900s and seeing how many times this charge was mentioned, how it was singled out to emulate to future generations. This is what a patriotic American does. This is what courage in the face of adversity looks like. This was such an inspiring moment that it inspired people to create plays, to create silent films. Bronson Howard wrote a play entitled The Greater Shenandoah that in the early 1900s was turned into a silent film. The major attraction for the play and the film was the great cavalry charge at Winchester. So this was something that wasn't just a moment in time, it transcended time and place and was seen by so many people as instructive. So I want to thank all of you for coming today. I'm going to lead you back in to the exhibition area because there's just a few closing comments I want to make. Give you a chance if you want to sign up as a member of Fort Collier Civil War Center. Enter your the Battlefield Foundation has programs beginning, I believe, at 11 a.m. out at 3rd Winchester Battlefield Park. I would argue that since the end of the Civil War, the Stine family has recognized the importance of this site to not only the Third Battle of Winchester, but to American history. And there is massive amounts of evidence that in the decades after the conflict, the members of the Stine family preserved everything that they discovered out here. And you could imagine the amount of relics that are here in the aftermath of the war. And so we're happy to bring on display some of those artifacts that were in the collections of the Stine family for so many years. So everything that you see in here, this all comes from Fort Collier. All things that were discovered over the years by members of the Stine family. One of the coolest things is that bent bayonet that was actually helped to use during the entrenching process in 1861. There are, artifacts like this. This is on temporary loan for the day from Patrick Stine, who is a member of our board. But this saber, Union Cavalry saber, was found in the corn crib in 1903 by a member of the Stine family. And so the Stine family was not only preserving the artifacts, but they were welcoming tourists. And so I'd encourage you all to come up and look at this stuff. Obviously, don't touch, because we understand how we should act in a historic setting. But this is a sign from the early 1900s. And it's pretty faded over the course of time, but you can make out, it reads, "Tourist Fort Collier, come see us." It's hanging out here. And so they were very well aware, again, of the significance of this property. There are newspapers all throughout Virginia that are listing places in like 1940. If you come to Winchester, these are places to see. And Fort Collier was at the top of the list along with George Washington's headquarters and the grave of the Revolutionary War hero General Daniel Morgan. And so I think the Stine family, and we have a number of Stine descendants who are here today, I think we owe them a debt of gratitude. Because had they not had the wherewithal since the end of the war to collect these artifacts, preserve these artifacts, make certain that they were passed down to what is now the Fort Collier Civil War Center, and continuously through the generations welcome people, this might be a mini mall today, where you could buy a cell phone and get your nails done and buy a Jimmy John's hoagie. And so I think the Stine family, when we talk about preservation, I would argue the Stines are probably the earliest preservationists in the valley. So I think we should give the Stine descendants who are here a round of applause. So that concludes our festivities for today. Again, if you want to sign up for a Fort Collier membership, we have forms out there, and we have board members who are willing to take your money and enter you to that special once-in-a-lifetime raffle. So that's it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, John.